Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. Our first selection this week is entitled Loving the Westminster Confession and Catechisms. Written by David B. Calhoun, it appeared in the December 2017 issue of the magazine, number 651. When James Henley Thornwell was inaugurated as professor at Columbia Seminary in 1855, he was asked the question, "Do you accept the Westminster Confession?" "Accept it," he replied. "I love it. I love it with all my heart." Writing a few years earlier, Princeton Seminary's Archibald Alexander explained why we love the Westminster Confession and Catechisms. "We venerate these standards partly because they embody the wisdom of an august synod, because they come down to us associated with the memory and faith of saints and martyrs and embalmed with their blood. But we love them most of all because they contain the truth of God, that truth which forms the foundation of our hopes. As our fathers prized them, and we prize them, so may our children and our children's children love and preserve them." Scottish children were brought up, it was said, on porridge and the Shorter Catechism, a blessing for both body and soul. Oatmeal is now touted as one of the most heart-healthy foods you can eat, and the Shorter Catechism strengthens the mind and blesses the soul. Its contents laid what John G. Paton, the 19th century missionary to the New Hebrides from Scotland's Reformed Presbyterian Church, called the solid rock foundations of generations of Christian lives. I don't know whether or not Scottish children got tired of porridge every morning, but some, probably many, grew weary of the Catechism. One who did, although he could never escape its memorable words, was Robert Louis Stevenson. "The happiest lot on earth is to be born a Scotchman," wrote Stevenson. "But you must pay for it in many ways, as for all other advantages on earth. You have to learn the psalm paraphrases and the Shorter Catechism." The famous New England Primer, for more than 100 years the beginning textbook for American children, contained the Shorter Catechism. In one printing we read, "Our Puritan fathers brought the Shorter Catechism with them across the ocean and laid it on the same shelf as the family Bible. They taught it diligently to their children. If, in this catechism, the true and fundamental doctrines of the gospel are expressed in fewer and better words and definitions than in any other summary, why ought we not now to train up a child in the way he should go?" Times have changed, and today very few children, indeed very few Presbyterian children, learn the Catechism. A 1953 editorial in the Southern Presbyterian Journal paid tribute to what it called an almost departed friend, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. "The document is a relic of ecclesiastical aristocracy and holds a secure high place in Presbyterian history," the editorial stated. "In some respects, it is like the grandfather's clock that stands on the stairway landing, grim and unyielding, defying removal, a valued heirloom, but it isn't running anymore." But the old documents produced by the Westminster divines in the 1640s are still alive and timely, giving us, in the words of a 1729 American edition, good forms of sound words about what we are to believe concerning God and what duty God requires of us. We love the Westminster Standards not as we love the Bible, only the law of the Lord is perfect, Psalm 19:7, but as a help in faith and practice, as the confession itself teaches in chapter 31. When students at Columbia Seminary asked Dr. William Childs Robinson, who you may remember incidentally from an earlier episode of the podcast, if the Westminster Standards were perfect, he would often reply, "No, but their exposition of faith is better than yours, and you can improve yours by studying theirs." During an evening walk in Columbia, South Carolina, young James Henley Thornwell happened into a bookstore and found, lying on the counter, a small volume entitled Confession of Faith. He bought it for 25 cents, carried it home, and read it from beginning to end. The Westminster Confession of Faith clarified his thinking about God and set him on a theological path from which he never turned. Years later, he praised the Westminster Confession and Catechisms for their richness of matter, clearness of statement, soundness of doctrine, scriptural expression, and edifying tendency. Writing about Jonathan Edwards, Max Stackhouse states that the Puritans, such as those 17th century pastors who drew up the Westminster Confession and Catechisms, were earnest folk who wanted people to find a confidence for living in this precarious world. Those in drift could not do that. They were like a bug on a leaf in a river during a storm. They had no sense of where they were or where they were going. The Westminster Confession and Catechisms teach us about God, about ourselves, and give us the purpose of our lives, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. When Alexander Witt came as Dr. Candlish's assistant to Free St. George's in Edinburgh, the church he would pastor for nearly 50 years, he visited one of the church's elders who was dying. The godly old man had a book open on his pillow. It was the Westminster Confession of Faith, open to its great chapter on justification by faith, chapter 11. "I am dying on that gospel chapter," he told the young minister. Witt read aloud the much-loved words, "Those whom God effectually calleth, he also freely justifieth, not by infusing righteousness into them, but by pardoning their sins, and by accounting and accepting their persons as righteous, not for anything wrought in them or done by them, but for Christ's sake alone, not by imputing faith itself, the act of believing, or any other evangelical obedience to them as their righteousness, but by imputing the obedience and satisfaction of Christ unto them, they receiving and resting on him and his righteousness by faith, which faith they have not of themselves, it is the gift of God." When Alexander Witt finished reading the rest of chapter 11, the elder fell asleep in Jesus. The truth found in the Confession and Catechisms not only feeds our minds by teaching what we are to believe concerning God, but it also shapes our lives by teaching us what duty God requires of us. B.B. Warfield writes about an officer of the United States Army who was in a western city during a time of violent rioting. One day, he saw approaching him a man whose very appearance of calm and resolve inspired confidence. The two men passed each other, then each stopped to look back at the other. The stranger came back to the officer and, touching his chest with his forefinger, demanded without introduction, "What is the chief end of man?" On receiving the answer, "Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever," he said, I knew you were a shorter catechism boy by your looks." "Why, that was just what I was thinking of you," came the answer. While it may be impossible to tell whether a person knows the catechism simply by his or her looks, the true knowledge of its contents will produce in one's life a visible demonstration of Christian character. In his Creeds and Confessions of Faith, Jaroslav Pelikan argues that, far from encouraging moral lassitude on the grounds that only true doctrine matters, a passionate zeal for orthodoxy has historically become a special cause for those who have consecrated their lives to good works. In her book, By the Renewing of Your Minds, The Pastoral Function of Christian Doctrine, Princeton Seminary professor Ellen T. Charry claims that Christian doctrines are good for us by forming or reforming our character. She shows how theologians such as Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm, Calvin, and others understood human happiness to be tied to virtuous character, which in turn comes from knowing God. In these older theological writings, Charry asserts, evangelism, catechesis, moral exhortation, dogmatic exegesis, pastoral care, and apologetics were all happening at the same time. In his opening address to the Princeton Seminary students on September 20, 1903, B.B. Warfield recommended some books that the students should read in order to nurture their spiritual life. He ended with the statement that the creeds of Christendom are more directly, richly, and evangelically devotional than any other writings apart from the Bible. He recommended especially the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Heidelberg Catechism. Warfield said, "He who wishes to grow strong in his religious life, let him, I say, next to the Bible, feed himself on the great creeds of the Church. They are not metaphysical speculation," said Warfield, "but compressed and weighted utterances of the Christian heart." Who can read those searching chapters, 17 and 18, on perseverance and assurance, Warfield asked, without feeling his soul burn within him, or without experience of a new influx of courage and patience for the conflicts of life? James Henley Thornwell found the Westminster documents to be not only an incomparable statement of biblical truth, but also a rich source of spiritual nourishment. During a sea voyage to Europe, Thornwell wrote on May 22, 1841, "It is now Saturday night, and I must prepare for the Holy Sabbath. My Bible and Confession of Faith are my traveling companions, and precious friends they have been to me. I bless God for that glorious summary of Christian doctrine contained in our noble standards. It has cheered my soul in many a dark hour, and sustained me in many a desponding moment. I love to read it, and ponder carefully each proof text as I pass along." We love the Westminster Confession and the larger and shorter catechisms because, in 33 chapters and in over 300 questions and answers, they preserve and set forth the precious gospel in their protecting envelope of sound words. In that selection, David Calhoun cites B.B. Warfield, and in the second volume of our book, Princeton and the Work of the Christian Ministry, can be found Warfield's address, The Significance of the Westminster Standards as a Creed. One of the subjects Warfield addresses in that piece is how conflict often leads to the formulation of the very most profound confessions of the Christian Church. We'll read now a section of that piece which highlights the role of conflict in the formulation of confessions. Talking about the context in which the Westminster Confession was formulated, Warfield writes the following: "One evil had hitherto been spared the Reformed churches. Every conceivable assault had been made upon them from without, but no serious internal treason had as yet endangered the purity of their confession. With the second century of their existence, even this trial was to fall upon them. It came in what we know as the Remonstrant controversy, in which the old humanitarian conceptions, the violent assertion of which had been the occasion of Augustine's republication of the Gospel of Grace, and by the more measured and subtle working of which evangelical religion had been gradually throttled in the Latin Church, reappeared in the very bosom of the Reformed churches themselves, and jeopardized the purity of their assertion of the gospel. We all know how the new danger was transcended. Met in ecumenical synod at Dort, the Reformed churches gave renewed and serious consideration, in the light of Scripture alone, to those elements of evangelical religion to which exception had been taken, and with one tongue, voicing the testimony of the whole Reformed world, bore their solemn witness to them as essential elements in the gospel of God's grace. But the end was not even yet. Transferred to English ground, the assault was continued for a third of a century longer, under circumstances which gave it the highest conceivable force and speciousness. Here, sacerdotalism, in the form of Anglican prelacy, presented itself in the disguise of the Reformed religion itself. Here, humanitarianism put on the garments of light, allied itself with religious fervor, and ran up by insensible stages into a mysticism which confounded human claims with the very voice of God. This is the meaning of what we call the Puritan conflict, which, from the theological side, was nothing else than the last deadly struggle of evangelical religion, the gospel of God's grace, to preserve itself, pure and sweet and clean, in the midst of the most insidious attacks which could be brought against it. Attacks, the strength of which resided just in the fact that now its old-time foes approached it with the sword in hand. Indeed, and with no loss of their undying hatred, but under its own banner and clothed in its own uniform. It was a battle to the death, and the arts of war could not but be learned in its progress. To meet so protean a foe, attacking at every point with weapons of unexampled fineness and tactics of unimagined subtlety, a skill of fence and a wariness of defense unknown before were necessarily developed, and with them those high qualities which underlie them: keenness of perception, clearness of vision, firmness of purpose, accuracy of aim, precision of movement straight to the essential goal. Men trained in this school could not be content with merely general statements of the truth by which they lived, and which would long since have been wrested from them had they held to it with only a broad and therefore loose grasp. In the strenuousness of the conflict, they had not only learned how to state the gospel sharply, distinctly, precisely, they had, so to speak, lost the power of stating it otherwise than with clearness and exactitude and force. As well expect the veteran fresh from the wars to bungle in his fence, nay, his blade takes instinctively the correct attitude of guard, and eye and wrist move in such organic harmony that it would be only with an effort that either could prove false to its fellow. As well expect the mountaineer who has trodden the peaks from infancy to stumble heavily over his arête and passes. He knows not how to do otherwise than to step cleanly and surely and firmly, and he instinctively plants his feet where they cannot be moved. So, when this company of Puritan pastors was gathered from the parishes of England which they had saved for the gospel, and was bidden, write down this gospel, they could not do otherwise than to write it down with that rich completeness which had nourished their own souls and the souls of their flocks in those times of conflict and often almost of despair, and with that precision in which alone it could preserve its integrity and power in the face of the violent and insidious foes to the attacks of which it had been, in their own experience, exposed. This theme of the role of crises, which beget confessions, was taken up by John R. de Witt in his article Confessions and Crises in Church History. It was printed in issue number 50, which was September and October 1967, of the Banner of Truth magazine. Readers may be interested to know that that issue of the magazine would have set them back 1 shilling and 6pence. We'll read the text as it appears in that issue, which itself was an extract from an article by Mr. de Witt in Missionary Monthly from December 1966. A study of the creedal statements of the Church reveals that in most cases, a successful confession arises from such peculiarly critical and urgent conditions as those which require Christians to give utterance to the great truths of the divine revelation. A confession is not decided upon. It is called forth by the pressing questions of the day. It is a reaction to assault, an attempt at confession in the face of danger, an answer to the challenge of error and unbelief. The Church in the 4th century did not suddenly decide, de novo, out of a clear blue sky, that a creed treating of the doctrine of the Trinity would be a good idea. It took centuries of conflict and the pressing immediacy of the Arian heresy, and the inroads it had been making upon the evangelical faith of the Church to produce the Nicene Creed. And it took a man of the grand and heroic proportions of an Athanasius, whom one need not hesitate to call God's prophet for his day. The same, though perhaps in a somewhat more tempered sense, can be said of the origins of the 3 confessional statements which we possess, and which are to be numbered among the treasures of the Church of Jesus Christ, especially as it is reformed according to the Word of God, namely the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the canons of the Synod of Dort. Anyone who cares to look into the matter will soon discover, for example, what the situation was in the United Provinces of the Netherlands during the early years of the 17th century, when the Arminian heresy was lifting its head, as it has done so often before and since, and what a crisis confronted not only the Dutch Church, but the Reformed churches generally. The Westminster Standards, in their historical setting, reveal something of the very same thing. England was on fire. The Parliament had set itself against a faithless king and a tyrannical ecclesiastical establishment. Civil liberties were in process of being acquired, and with them, because the members of the Long Parliament were in large measure men of serious Protestant faith, it was determined that the battle for the freedom of the realm and the reform of the nation should be accompanied with a resettlement of the Church and a definitive and intensely biblical statement of its faith. Hence, the summoning of the assembly which met those long years during the 1640s in the Jerusalem chamber of Westminster Abbey, and which produced the, in many respects, superb standards that have continued to bear its name. Again, a crisis, and again, a great confession. But to introduce more evidence is surely superfluous. The fact is self-evident. Great and crucial periods in the history of the Church have brought forth, in much pain and travail both of mind and of spirit, similarly great and enduring declarations of the content and definition of the Christian faith. With the same breath, it ought also to be pointed out that the historic creeds have been written by men who were singularly gifted and well equipped for the task that was thrust upon them. They were, in many cases, the ornaments of the Church, of lasting name and reputation, whom their brethren in the faith recognized as such, and put to work to forge those tools for instruction and confession of which the Church has constantly made use. In mentioning such names as Calvin and Luther, Ursinus and Olevianus, Gomarus and Borgerman, Burgess and Marshall, Henderson and Rutherford, one is possessed by the conviction that these men were raised up by God and endowed with singular gifts and capacities in order to do the staggering and splendid work which history demanded of them. And work they did. The Synod of Dort sat for 154 sessions to produce its immortal canons against the Arminian heresy. Struthers and Mitchell, in their edition of the Minutes of the Westminster Assembly, list 1,163 sessions of that assembly between the years 1643 and 1648, after which still more occurred which do not have place in the printed text. And to list mere numbers does not give any accurate picture of the debates, discussions, committee meetings, private years of study, and the like, all of which went into the preparation of the documents which we take so very much for granted. A crisis in the history of the Church, men peculiarly suited by God for their task, great theological competence, deep and abiding faith proved by the fires of persecution, dedicated work extending often into years of concentrated study and debate. These are the ingredients of genuine confession, and the standard against which any modern attempt is to be measured and judged successful or found wanting.
Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.